Would you like 5 tips for improving your job interview performance? Well, watch the next video. Hi YouTube, I'm Dr. Anthony Llewellyn. I'm the career doctor. I'm here to help you manage your career. Today I'm going to cover 5 tips for improving your interview performance. This is going to be useful for any doctor candidates who are about to sit an interview for a medical job or perhaps trainee selection. But actually the content's going to be just as applicable to any doctor or indeed pretty much anyone else going through an interview process. By the way, if you're liking my videos, leave a like below or a comment, and if you're watching a few, you might want to consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you get notified the next time a video comes out. Also, I'd be interested to know whether you think these tips are useful or maybe I've missed a top tip out. Leave me a comment below. Okay, today on the channel we're covering 5 top tips for your job interview. Let's get stuck in right now with tip number 1. So tip number 1 is the most vital in my opinion, and it's this: that you should treat the interview as an examination or a performance. When you're in medical school, you practice for all those exams, didn't you? Right? Well, you shouldn't just expect to turn up to the medical job interview, which is equally high stakes, wing it and turn in a stellar performance, okay? You need a practice schedule and you need to actually practice. So what I recommend you do is give yourself at least 6 weeks time ahead of the interview date to do some of that practice and preparation. Generally, for at least trainee medical job interviews, you've got a fair bit of warning as to when the interview date might be. So you might actually have a few months to prepare, and if you do, that's even better. Start as soon as possible. What I find with my interview candidates is the first session is really good for clearing out the cobwebs and getting the rust off the system. A lot of the time it's about ripping off the band-aid and actually starting some practice. Once you get into it, it's a lot easier. There's a lot of hesitancy initially reviewing how you look and perform an interview or just talking about yourself. So you just need to get over that and get into an interview practice schedule. If possible, I recommend, let's say we're taking 6 weeks before the interview, to do at least 1 session per week, with some of those sessions being actual feedback from another expert. And we'll get to that later in the video as to who I recommend as an expert. So tip number 2 is understand what the interview panel is actually looking for, so you can actually practice the right questions and prepare examples that might be useful. I'm often asked by doctors, how can I predict the type of questions I'm going to get in the interview? And actually it's a lot easier than you think. The questions that you get asked in the interview should relate to the selection criteria. So what you need to do is find this section on the job description and review it. This should give you a fair indication of the types of questions you'll be asked and what the panel will be looking for in those questions. Sometimes, particularly for college selection, rather than selection criteria, there's something called a competency framework. Again, this is pretty much like a selection criteria, and it will give you a good guide as to what they're looking for. You can then generate appropriate questions, or you can find places online where there's a lot of questions that you can use to practice for the selection criteria or competency framework. I'll leave a link in the description below to our free question bank that has a heap of questions that will get you started. Tip number 3 is to review your CV for the examples that you think you'll need to be able to use and provide for these questions in the interview. Remember that providing an example from your past work is extremely powerful in the interview process. Now sometimes you'll be given a question where you're actually asked to provide an example, but even for situational or hypothetical questions, you can actually provide an example. And you're basically doing this to tell the panel that I can do it, I've done this before, and that's a really powerful thing to do, because panels know that past performance predicts future performance. Tip number 4, record yourself and watch yourself back. Interviews are as much about body language and tone of speech as they are about the content of our talk. It's important to know how you appear during an interview. The only way you will know this is to actually watch yourself. So here's a great example. Often when I'm coaching candidates for interviews, I notice that they appear quite stiff in their presentation. This is normally because they're trying to control their hands and stop them moving around, because they believe by doing that it appears more professional. So they're actually either sitting on them or maybe anchoring them in their lap. The thing is, generally for most people, it's actually better to let your hands do some of the talking, as they say. It actually looks more authentic and it shows passion in your interview responses. So once we notice this and we fix the problem, The overall appearance of the interview looks remarkably better already. Tip number 5, and my final interview tip, is to get some interview practice with an expert. Now, what do I mean by an expert? I mean anyone who has had significant experience with being a member of a selection panel and or experience in coaching candidates for the type of interviews that you're going for. Preferably both. So as a minimum, try and get someone like a director of medical services or a director of training to give you a couple of sessions. These folks have generally sat in on hundreds of interviews and know what's required. Don't fall into the trap of relying on feedback from fellow candidates, your family or friends, those sort of people. The problem there is that the type of feedback you're usually going to get is not going to be critical enough, and they won't have the context for what the selection panel is after, so they may steer you down the wrong path. And of course, if you want to up your game and performance to a higher level, then an interview coach is definitely the way to go, and you can use someone like myself, and I've got links to some of my services in the description below. So there you go, 5 top tips for improving your interview performance. What did you think? Were those tips helpful for you? Do you think they'll be useful in approaching your next interview? Have you actually thought about putting together a practice plan for your interview? I'd be keen to get your feedback in the comments in the description below. I'll leave a bunch of links to useful resources, including a blog post I've written about this topic. And as always, if you like this video, please leave me a like. And if you're watching a few, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. If I'm catching up with you tomorrow at the careers workshop, I look forward to saying hi to you in person. Apologies about the green screen or lack thereof today. It's packed up, ready to go for the conference. And I will see you in the next video.